All right. As we get started tonight, I just want to think about kind of where we are in the overall story of Revelation. What we have said is that in general, the main story, the main message of Revelation has been told already. All right, we said that really you could say that by the end of chapter 15, 14, now I'm mixing up my numbers. The story itself has concluded, but then there was a little bit of an overlap and a little bit of a retelling of the story in some way through chapter 19. The main message of Revelation has been told, and you could say that we're kind of in the epilogue of the story, the aftermath, if you will. But I want us to remember what is the main message, what is the main primary story that has been told in Revelation. I've done such a great job teaching this class, apparently. Okay. Right. Okay, so for our purposes, for the application side of it, the message is we can remain faithful too, like those who endured persecution in the early church. And we can see how God got them through it and how God carried them through to the end. And we too can know that that's what God expects of us. The overall story as it played out in the lives of those who first received the message is essentially that persecution is going to come. There's no debating that. There's no avoiding that, right? Persecution is going to come. Some of you are going to endure a lot of persecution. Some of you are going to die in the face of this persecution that's coming. But you need to know that even though it's going to be bad, really bad for a period of time, God has not abandoned you, and God is going to carry out his vengeance upon those persecutors, upon those who have brought about these troubles for you. God is not going to ignore that, all right? And so in various ways and through a lot of different symbols, that's essentially the message that's being given to these Christians in the first century. That's being preparing them for the persecution that's going to come, right? And we talked about a lot of different things at the beginning of this class, keys to understanding the book as a whole, and how these were going to be things that were going to come soon, and these were going to be things that they were going to have to endure. And there's a lot of symbolic language in this book. Well, as representations of the persecution itself, we have seen two beasts and a harlot or a prostitute who have been defeated. Now, the harlot was just in recent chapters, and then the two beasts, well, they weren't defeated until recently, but we saw that they were not able to overcome the people of God and the Lamb of God, etc. All right, and they have been completely, by the time we get to where we are tonight, they have been completely defeated. All right, and who was it that ultimately defeated them all? It was the Lamb. It was Jesus, represented by a lamb in chapter 17 and the rider on the white horse at the end of chapter 19. Now, if the two beasts have been defeated, if the harlot has been defeated, who's left? The dragon, Satan, right? As we start looking at what happens to him, and we're in this epilogue to the story itself, tonight we're going to get into a part of Revelation that is often very confusing, as if the rest of it hadn't been already, right? But it's even more challenging, I think, because of all the different ideas that come out of just a few verses in chapter 20. And I'll say that the ideas, most of them that come out of chapter 20, are based only in chapter 20. And they are not usually ideas that take the context of the entire book of Revelation into account. Never mind the context of the entire New Testament and how there are passages that contradict what some people say verses 1 through 6 of chapter 20 teach. All right, so it's really important that we keep in mind the context of the whole story of Revelation. What is the point of this book, and what is the purpose it serves in the lives of the people who first received it? All right, because if it didn't mean something to them, whatever is being said in chapter 20, then it doesn't mean anything to anybody. Why would it be written? All right, so we're going to start with just 3 verses, because that's all we can handle. No, we're going to start with just 3 verses, kind of look at these for a minute, and then we'll keep going. Somebody read verses 1 through 3 of chapter 20. Okay, now, before we even start discussing what this is about, we have to remember symbolism, symbolism, symbolism. If everything for this entire story, outside of the letters that are written to specific churches, right? The vision that starts in chapter 4, if everything from that point forward through chapter 19 is symbolic and are images that represent specific things, why would we suddenly go away from that interpretation for chapter 20? We shouldn't. We are given no reason to, especially since the main character described here in these first 3 verses is what? What's the character? Well, it's the dragon, right? Which we know, we've been told specifically, represents Satan, right? All right? So if the dragon is a symbol that represents Satan, and all through the last 15 chapters of reading, we have seen symbol after symbol after symbol representing other things, we can't get away from that here and suddenly start saying, well, why doesn't that mean literally this and this and this? Okay? So keep that in mind as we move forward, because essentially the symbols, the symbolic story that is told in these 3 verses is a dragon goes to jail. Okay? Right? For 1,000 years. All right, this is I typed in dragon and jail, I think, and got this image. An iguana in a cage. Okay, I don't know. Okay, so the dragon is imprisoned in some form in a bottomless pit, or if your translation says the abyss, that's okay. Same thing. For 1,000 years. Right? That's what it says. Right? That is the symbols that are used to communicate a message. And our job is to figure out what does it actually mean as best we can, right? So here's an important question that I think we have to answer to really get a grasp of what is being meant by all the symbolism in these verses. Has Satan always been limited? Has he always been bound by certain rules or restrictions? Okay? How do we know? Okay, so here's one biblical example is in the book of Job. All right, so the book of Job we're really, really familiar with. The beginning of the book of Job, Satan, the accuser, approaches God and says, well, of course Job is going to be faithful to you because you've given him all this stuff. If you take away all that stuff, then he's not going to be faithful anymore. What's God's answer? What does he say? Okay, take everything away except can't touch him. Okay? So there's limits. God says, okay, go ahead. I will allow you, Satan, to do this, but there's limits. Of course, we know that Job loses practically everything, and he's still faithful. And so then Job approaches God a second time, and Satan approaches God a second time and says, well, you didn't let me do anything to him. I bet you if you let me harm him in some way, then his faith will dwindle and he won't profess you any longer. What does God say? Can't take his life. You can harm him, but you cannot take his life. And of course, that's exactly what Satan is allowed to do. And Job remains faithful, and then his friends make life miserable for about 38 chapters. And and then Job gets an answer that's not really an answer from God, but he remains faithful through it all, right? So the story of Job is, in my mind, the perfect answer to this question, right? Satan has limitations. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13 says, we will not be tempted beyond what we are able to bear, right? That's one of those verses that's pulled out of context a lot, right? It does not say God will never give you more than you can handle. That's not what it says. You will never be tempted beyond what you can bear. Satan has limitations on what he is allowed to produce in your life. He has limitations on how he is allowed to tempt you. Satan has limitations set upon him by God. God is still in control. God is still the one regulating Satan. All right. Now, the reason that is so important is if this is true, which multiple places in Scripture will verify that for us, if this is true, then it shouldn't come as a shock to us that we see an image, a symbol of Satan being limited or constrained in some way. Now, in this case, we see that he is limited for a specific reason. When he is bound or when he is imprisoned, what is it that John tells us he is no longer going to be allowed to do? Deceive the nations, right? He is not going to be allowed to deceive the nations, but there's two words that really change how we need to understand what's happening here. And it's those last two words: no more or any longer. Now, 2 points here that I think we need to really understand. Number one, it's really important that we recognize there has not been some huge leap forward in time. We are still basically the end of chapter 19, which was the completion of God's judgment upon the persecutors, which we understand to be the fall of Rome. That has completed. We have not jumped ahead thousands of years to the end of time. There is absolutely no indication that anything like that has happened. All right? And the reason that that is important is because some want to say that either we have jumped way forward in time and are talking about end time events now, or some want to say that the binding of Satan occurred when Jesus died on the cross. Now, I think in our minds, that feels right, doesn't it? You know, that Satan was defeated when Jesus died on the cross, right? He was bound in some way by Jesus' death on the cross because it really put a thorn in his side or really hampered his plans when Jesus died on the cross. But in the context of the book of Revelation, it doesn't fit at all. And the same is true of one of the other common explanations. Others say that this binding of Satan is taking place when the church is established in Acts chapter 2. Again, that might feel like that kind of fits. It was harmful to Satan that the church began on that day, and so many were added to the church that day, and it began to spread so rapidly. But again, that does not fit the context of where we are in the story of Revelation at all. Right? So we haven't jumped way far in advance toward the end of time, and we haven't jumped backwards in time either. We're still working around the same time period. All right? The second point that I think is really important here is that if Satan, the dragon, is being prevented from deceiving the nations any longer, what does that imply? That he has been doing exactly that, right? So, whatever is meant by the language here, we're talking about something that has already been going on, something that Satan has been doing and now is going to stop. Now, with that in mind, what have we seen over, if you were going to try and sum up the last 15 chapters, what have we seen Satan doing in summary? Oh, okay. Trying to put a stop to the church and or God's plan. Right? I think that's a perfect summary of essentially what's been happening. Satan is trying whatever he can to put a stop to God's people. Right? Now, what method have we been studying? What method have we been saying that Satan has tried to use to accomplish that? Persecution via or through the Roman Empire, right? The Roman Empire essentially represents state-sponsored persecution of Christians, right? Satan is using the nations or at least in this case, an empire made up of nations, to persecute Christians. So, it would seem to me that what's being said here is that Satan is going to be limited for a period of time in the sense that he is not going to be allowed to lead a national power to persecute Christians in an effort to wipe out the church. Now, let me restate that to make sure that we're understanding. The limitation that seems to be upon Satan is that he is no longer going to be allowed to use a national power to persecute Christians in an effort to eliminate the church. Now, hold that thought. Hold that thought for about the next 8 days, because we're going to have to kind of try to piece all this together over the next 2 or maybe more classes, okay? Now, during this same period of time, during this same 1,000 years, which we'll get to later, something else is also happening. And that's in verses 4 through 6. All right? Somebody read these verses for us.
I saw thrones of which were seated those who had been given authority to judge. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony about Jesus, because of the word of God. They had not worshipped the beast or its image, and not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. The rest of the dead not come to life. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and of Christ.
Okay, now, once again, symbolism, symbolism, symbolism. We don't get to leave that behind in order to try and interpret these verses. But also, it's really important. We need to remember, when are we talking about? We're talking about this is following the events of the fall of Rome still. We have not leapt forward thousands of years to the end of time. There's no indication of any such thing. And that's really important in these verses. It's important in verses 1 through 3, but it's really important in these verses because these are the ones that are most often used to teach that Jesus is going to come to the earth and reign for 1,000 years on the earth with a bunch of formerly faithful people. So we need to answer several questions in order to try and understand what's going on here. And really, most of the questions are about the people who are described as reigning with Jesus. Okay? Now, we're not going to get to all these tonight, so this is definitely going to carry us into next week. But the first question is, who are the people that are reigning with Jesus? And in order to answer that, look at how they are described. How are these people described? Okay, they were beheaded. Why were they beheaded? Because they followed Jesus, right? For the testimony of Jesus and the Word of God. How else are they described? Okay, they did not worship the beast. They did not worship the image of the beast. And they did not have his mark on their head or on their hand. Now, all of this, let me rephrase that. None of this is new to us, is it? This is familiar descriptors that have been used multiple times in the book of Revelation. Who is this referring to? Somebody said it. The martyrs. Yes, the martyrs that we see that show up multiple times throughout the book of Revelation. They show up first in chapter 6. They're the ones who are saying, how long are we going to have to wait, Lord, before you carry out vengeance for our blood that has been spilled? And then they're shown again in Revelation chapter 7, and they're given they were given the robes in chapter 6. They're wearing the white robes again in chapter 7. In Revelation 14, they're joined by more martyrs after the persecution has been carried on for a period of time. In Revelation chapter 15, they're the ones who are gathered at the sea and are described as being victorious over the beast. And then Revelation chapter 19, they're the ones who are rejoicing over the fact that the harlot has been defeated. The story of the book of Revelation is their story. This is who it's about. Because it's answering that first question that they're asking. God, and it's almost like they're crying out in chapter 6, Lord, don't you care? Don't you care about your people who are suffering and dying? Are you not going to do anything about this? Are you just going to stand back and watch? And the whole rest of the book moving forward is talking about how, no, God's not going to just sit back and watch. Yes, certain things are going to happen. Yes, persecution is going to come. Yes, more of you are going to die. But God is still God, and he is still the one in control, and he is still going to carry out his vengeance. Theirs is the story of the book of Revelation. Now, other than Jesus, who else besides the martyrs is said to be reigning here? That's it, right? There's nobody else. There's nothing here that even hints at the idea that we're talking about all Christians or all Christians who lived up to a certain time or anything of that nature. This is a specific group of people who have dealt with specific persecution that has been described in a variety of ways all the way through the book of Revelation up through now. All right? So we know who is represented by this group that's described. Now, why are they reigning? Now, you'll notice that I put the word reigning in parentheses. We'll get to that in just a second. But first, let's think about the context of all that we've been looking at. In a word, I think you could say that these martyrs are victorious. They're even described as such. And we've mentioned this before, but it's important that we acknowledge this here again. Why would you be able to say that these who have lost their lives are still victorious? Okay, I mean, even before we get to that part, why would we say, looking back at what we've seen throughout the book of Revelation, why could we say that they are victorious? Because they were faithful even to death, right? They did not relinquish their faith at all, no matter what kind of persecution came upon them, all right? And here we are, they have been faithful through all kinds of persecution, and now their persecutor has been defeated. And what kind of mood did we notice in chapter 19 before we even got to chapter 20? What did we say last week was the mood of chapter 19? as all those around realized the defeat of the persecutors. It was happy, it was joyful, it was celebratory, right? It's the kind of mood that you would expect after a great victory has been won. Which I think brings us back to the question of why they are reigning. All right? If everything has been symbolic, if the dragon does not mean a literal dragon, if the lamb does not mean a literal lamb, if the bottomless pit does not necessarily mean a literal bottomless pit, then why would we assume then that reigning means literally reigning on a literal throne? The answer is we shouldn't. So, the question is then, what would the idea of reigning alongside Jesus symbolize for those martyrs who have been faithful to the end, who have been victorious? I think it represents how they have conquered the beast and how they have conquered it through their faith. And now that the threat of the beasts is over, they are reigning over those threats. They are victorious over those threats. They are celebrating the fact that they have been faithful to the end, and they're here with Jesus when things could have gone very differently. Now, I want you to hold that thought as we move into the last question that we're going to try and answer tonight, which is, where do they reign? Now, those who teach certain things about the 1,000 years say that that reign is happening on earth. So, I want you to look at these verses, and I want you to find me something, a reference to something that's happening on earth. Go ahead, I'll wait. Illuminati. Okay, we're going to skip on past that one. Okay, the fact is, it's just not there. In fact, every place that this same group of people are referenced in the book of Revelation, guess where they are? They're in heaven. Yeah, not once do they show up on earth. And every time Jesus is mentioned in the book of Revelation, there's no mention of him stepping foot on earth. He is over and over depicted as in heaven. The only way you can jump to the conclusion that this is on earth is by taking one phrase and assuming an awful lot about what it means. And it's the phrase, came to life. And then what you have to assume is that that is a literal coming to life, even though we're in the middle of a very symbolic book, and then made their way literally to earth. Again, even though we're in the middle of a very symbolic book. The other thing that we have to understand here is that we see thrones over and over and over as images in the book of Revelation, right? God's throne, Jesus' throne, the 24 elders' thrones. You know, one thing that they all have in common is where they're located. It's in heaven. Every single time. With one exception. And it's in chapter 2, in one of the letters. In the letter to the church in Pergamum, chapter 2 and verse 13, there's one throne that's mentioned that's on earth rather than in heaven. Guess whose throne that is? It's Satan's throne. In the letter to the church in Pergamum, the message is, I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, yet you hold fast my name and you did not deny my faith. The message is, hey, look, you are living your lives out in the place where Satan reigns, where Satan is sitting on his throne. And yet you're still able to remain faithful. Good job. I mean, it's a pat on the back for this church in Pergamum. That's the only throne in all of Revelation that is ever said to be on earth. So I find it very, very difficult to ever draw the conclusion that we are talking about literal people literally reigning on literal thrones on a literal earth. That requires way too many assumptions and leaps to get to where you set aside a book that is so symbolic in nature. Drop the mic. Okay. Now, I anticipated either more of you arguing with me or having more to say as we went through this, because that's actually all I had for tonight, because the next question is one that's going to take us a while, because the next question is, when are they reigning? And we're going to have to deal with the 1,000 years and what does that mean, and all the multitude of ideas out there, and we will be talking about all of that. So let me give you a few minutes here at the end. What questions do you have about what we've covered tonight? Or other nights, I guess, you know. Yes. Sure. Okay, so the question is about Constantine and how the persecution of the church really tailed off during his reign, because Christianity, not only was it recognized as an acceptable religion, but during his time it became the official religion of the Roman Empire. He was in I want to say 325 is when he the what is the edict that he passed? I can't remember. The Nicene Creed is the thing that's going through my head, and I know that's not it. But right. He claimed to have this vision and all these things that transpired. You know, now whether or not that's true, that's a different discussion. But it is right around 325 A.D. that took place. Now the Roman Empire lasted a little beyond that, into the 5th century before, but it was a slow process, the fall of the Roman Empire, because there were multiple outside enemies that attacked. The city of Rome was sacked 3 different times. You know, you've got the Huns and the Visigoths and the Vandals. I think those are the 3 that sacked Rome. That may not be, the Huns may not be right, but they definitely were a part of the destruction of the empire and the collapse that took place, because it just kind of crumbled over time. And so, I don't. Yes, thank you. The Edict of Milan was in 313. Okay. All right. So I was off by 12 years. But yes, that's definitely the point at which you see a significant change in the attitude of the empire toward Christians. Between East and West, right. Right. The Yeah, can't remember all the details. That was the church history class. I've forgotten half of that class by now. It is a long time. Okay, so Scott's question is, was there persecution in the Roman Empire of Christians all the way up until Constantine, or did it trail off a little bit before that? If I'm remembering correctly, I do think that it was consistent. It was pretty bad for up until Constantine's time. And so part of the discussion I remember we did have in our church history class was it probably didn't just, Edict of Milan, okay, everybody's happy with Christians and we're going to treat them fairly. No, not likely. It probably took some time for that to really become an amicable situation for Christians in the Roman Empire. So, I mean, we're talking centuries of time, Now, in the grand scheme of things, that's not a really long time, right? But a couple hundred years of pretty devastating persecution for Christians. And you look at, I think David was scrolling through one night the different emperors, and some of the names that come up are pretty terrible names. Domitian is one that, especially in the 2nd century, was horrible for Christians to deal with. I don't, but I think only because the way I see the timeline playing out here is the enemy, the beast, or both beasts, and the harlot have all been defeated. And if we understand that to be the empire, the city of Rome, and the emperor worship that took place in Rome, then that has to all pass before this is taking place. Now, again, it is still symbolic language, and it's hard to try and tie real specific dates to things. God does what he wants in his time, right? So we have to do our best to understand it. I don't know that we can say with 100% certainty on some of that. Okay. Ooh. Okay. Man. Right. Okay, yes. So the question is about the Branch Davidians and David Koresh, right? And how did he use the book of Revelation to make those claims for himself, to be claiming to be the Messiah himself? I have no idea. Uh, mm, right. Okay. So yeah, and Tom makes a good point. Don't forget that one of the key definitions of a cult is that big personality that is the cult leader, right? Very charismatic, very easy to follow, and so um, mm, right, right, right. Yeah, that's a good point. The other thing that I wanted to say before we are done, because we are pretty much done, for next week, one of the things that we're going to talk about, I want you to, in preparation for next week, I want you to go just look up these three terms, just kind of see what you read about them and see what they tell, what you can find. All right? The terms are, the first one you're probably the most familiar with, premillennial, post-millennial, and amillennial, or amillennial, or non-millennial, or no, just go with amillennial. That's the most common term, even though that's not quite an accurate description, but that is the term that's most often used. Premillennial, postmillennial, and amillennial. A millennial was born in 2000, and no, we're not talking about millennials. That is not a part of this discussion. All right, let's have a prayer together, and we'll be done for tonight. Lord, we are so grateful for everything that you